Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Gernot Wagner, who's a climate economist at Columbia Business School. Professor Wagner, good to see you.
Good to see you.
So we are dealing with, of course, a lot of the smoke from the wildfires here in New York City, across a lot of the U.S. You've looked a lot at the economic impact. Give me some sense of the work you do and where this fits into it.
To be fair, right, even though we all focused on wildfires right now, I am far from a wildfire specialist, even though I, like to play one on TV. But, and this is, I guess, the big but in all of this, right? It's amazing to see how the direct effects, when they become really visible, like they currently are, right? Like, yesterday in New York City, 2:30 p.m., right? Like this yellow cloud moving in, and we all, right, we're literally choking in this pollution. Suddenly realize that, whoops, maybe there is something to these statistics, right? And when I say statistics, here's some, economic consequences of outdoor air pollution kills around 10 million people a year, globally, right? And, it's the old, trite statement that, a million deaths is a statistic, one is a tragedy, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, right? So welcome to New York City yesterday afternoon when, you go walk down First Avenue with your mask on, your eyes are watering, and you see a couple ambulances chasing up to Bellevue Hospital, and, well, no idea whether it was related to, right, the heart attack caused by this particular wildfire. But yeah, there are very direct impacts that go well beyond, right, sort of the, GDP might take a 0.01% hit because of, right? No, there are lives at stake. And yes, of course, that is also direct economic consequences.
Well, I'm fascinated by the fact that you are a climate economist. So, talk about the genesis of that. Obviously, now we have terms like climate math. When I talk to insurers, they talk about what can and cannot be insured now in light of some of the, if not, maybe sometimes lack of predictability, sometimes very predictable consequences they see of climate change. How do you marry those two together in terms of your own profession?
Well, okay, so about 20 years ago, right? So I've never done anything else in my life, I can tell you. And, 15, 20 years ago, when you told someone you were a climate economist, it was basically, wait, pick a side, right? Like, which is it? Do you care about the climate, or you care about, employment rates and exchange rates? I don't think, very few people consider it an oxymoron these days, because climate damages are real, are very vividly felt, right? Because climate risk is financial risk, right? None of this is news anymore. And yes, the solutions too are very much economics, broadly speaking, right? Rechanneling market forces in the right direction. And now that's not just sort of the simple, right, climate economic instruments that economists like to talk about. It's sort of pricing the negative externality in the all-encompassing sense. And frankly, it all comes together with this one number that very few people have heard of, but is probably the most important single metric as it relates to climate change, which is the social cost of carbon. Basically, what does each ton of CO2 emissions actually cost over its lifetime in the atmosphere, right? So, you and I, on average,
what do you calculate
American,
it to be?
So it's a couple $100 at least, that each ton, and to be clear, right, so this is not an abstract number. It's the average American emits about 16 of these tons of CO2 per year. Average European, by the way, around 8 or so. And, life in Europe isn't all that bad either, right? So, yes, there are ways to cut these emissions dramatically without, frankly, life-changing all that much. Each of these tons of CO2 causes at least those $100-$200 per ton of CO2 in damages. And that's the problem, right? Because, when I bought a flight to see my parents in Austria, that's a ton of CO2, a metric ton of CO2 emissions for that one ticket, right? Not the whole plane.
Really?
That one ticket.
Okay. And they now look
passenger.
I guess one thing that I find fascinating, let's look at economics writ large. There are always these catalyzing events that can mark a change in societal attitudes, in the same way that the financial crisis, perhaps changed our view of subprime mortgages. How much do you find these catalytic, climate events are changing attitudes? I mean, and I don't want to over-index on what happened in New York, California, and many other places have been living with this for years. But as an economist, do you think, have you noticed an impact? Because it's very visible and very, almost tactile in a way that you can now feel it, as opposed to it being an abstract concept.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, you can literally taste the pollution in your mouth, right?
Right,
right. This is sort of one of these times where I wished I had, Sarah Palin's superpowers, right? So, I love the smell of the emissions, right? Her famous statement during the campaign way back when. But of course, right? So, I mean, okay, based here in New York City, right? The Hurricane Sandy, over a decade ago by now, right, was one of these moments where, whoa, this stuff is hitting home. Well,
yeah, we really invested in resilience. Yeah.
So we did, and basically, I mean, yes, right. So that was the first time Wall Street was shut down for a natural event, right? For an environmental factor, for 2 days or so, and yeah, right. That clarified this the impacts of climate change, sea level rise, to many in the financial industry. Well, yes, we've had forest fires before, right? New York City has felt the impacts of Californian forest fires last year only. But of course, never as extreme as those current ones. And maybe what makes it even more dramatic, right? This is not like there's a forest fire in upstate New York that, a few hundred or a couple hundred miles or so away from us, maybe, or a few dozen miles away. No, this is forest fires throughout Canada. Like when you look at the map, right, it spans literally the entire continent, right, from the west coast to Ottawa to the east coast, Halifax, forest fires, and we are experiencing the impacts of all of the above, and basically there is no hiding from them, right? This is as hazy as the views are these days, right? It clearly is a clarifying moment.
It's interesting. There's been a lot of discussion on the economics front about pricing carbon, right? Really carbon offsets. I haven't seen as much around how do you create sort of an economic model around the cost, especially when the cost is being incurred by people who don't cause the problem. I mean, some people have talked about using the courts and some type of litigation if societies don't take enough action and it has consequences on another. As an economist, I'm just curious how you view this situation in terms of what are some of the ways in which we can look for economic, if not solutions, at least incentives to be reducing the risks that everybody incurs.
Well, okay, without being too philosophical here, I would say everything you've just mentioned, at the end of the day, is a price on carbon, right? So, it's sort of the slight historical example here, but the very first price on carbon, 1306, England, when King Edward I banned the burning of coal and put the death penalty on it for repeat offenders, right? Okay, that's an infinite price, if there ever was one. But yes, right. And by the way, no, it wasn't done for climate reasons, right? It was done because of air pollution, local air pollution.
Yeah.
The King's mother had asthma, in Nottingham. Now, that too, of course, right? An infinite price, a ban with or without death penalty is a price on carbon. Okay, well, the flip side, the Inflation Reduction Act is also a price on carbon. It's a relative price on carbon, right? When you subsidize the alternative, you make burning carbon more expensive, relatively speaking. Yeah, that too follows basically the exact same principle. Now, of course, okay, when I call all of that a price on carbon, then truly everything is, and in some philosophical sense, that's true. Now, as soon as you go into the details, yeah, there are better or worse ways to price the external effect of burning CO2. And yeah, we should be looking for the kind of policies that do it most efficiently, most effectively, of course. But, well, beggars can't be choosers, right? When the social cost of carbon is so high relative to where we currently are, when it is true that every barrel of oil, every ton of coal burned causes more in external damages than it adds value to GDP, we have a real problem, right? Which, by the way, none of what I just said means we need to stop burning coal overnight completely.
We can't.
Full stop, right? We can't. But yes, we are burning way too much of that stuff. Much too much. And yes, we can do a lot more than we currently do, of course. And most of the alternatives pay for themselves many times over. This is this amazing situation we are in, where it's not like, oh yeah, going on business as usual is just the obvious cheap way and everything else is just going to cost so much more. For the utilities, for example, our electricity prices would go through the roof. No, solar PV, right? Boring old solar photovoltaic technology is the cheapest form of electricity in history, according to the International Energy Agency, right? We are in a situation where the alternative is not, the costly environmental solution that, a bunch of crazies over there might pay for. No, it's the obviously cheaper thing to do right now. Why are we not doing it? Well, in this case, in the case of coal versus solar PV, because globally, more than 93% of global coal power is locked into long-term contracts of 20 years or longer. Right? So in this case, it's in some sense regulation standing in the way of us deploying the obvious cheaper technology. And yeah, that's a problem too, of course.
I want to get a little bit into you mentioned international. I mean, obviously these are fires coming from Canada. When we talk about water wars, that often crosses borders. Increasingly, I remember being in Singapore where often you'd get the wildfires from Indonesia that, would come in. Is it really, really these multilateral agreements? I mean, how does it impact the sort of economic fixes when it is really across border issues opposed to something within your own country? Maybe that's all of climate change.
Well, okay, so global warming, right? Global problem, global solution in some sense. But of course, I would say in many ways that is often used as an excuse, right? Than to say, even if we did everything to cut emissions, right, unless they over there do the same, and so on and so forth, right?
Right.
Which I think
blame
is
China
very much exactly right. Which is very much an excuse, just to be clear, right? And frankly, this is the exciting moment we are in, where we are in this global clean energy race, where in many ways it's a race to the top, not the usual race to the bottom. And when I say race to the top, right? So yeah, this is the U.S. Having passed the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Chips and Science Act. When you add it all up, it's a couple $1 trillion over a decade in subsidies pointing in the right direction that, yes, will pay for themselves many times over in terms of the learning by doing, positive learning by doing externality. And then you look at Europe and you say, well, yeah, we are in this race with each other in sort of electrifying the building sector, the transport sector, deploying cleaner, leaner, meaner technologies that, yes, pay for themselves. And yes, the name of the game is put the right policies in place to make it happen even faster, speed up this transition, which is a transition clearly in the right direction, right? In the direction of newer, better technologies. The big question is, how do you make it happen even faster?
Right.
How do you do it by basically subsidizing your own industry, onshoring your supply chain, creating more resiliency in your supply chain, and so on and so forth, and leading to a true race to the top here, as opposed to the usual sort of beggar thy neighbor policy, right? We will do it here in order to screw them over there.
Well, let me ask you another question, which is Inflation Reduction Act. The current policies in place, if they are implemented as planned, will that reduce us down from the 16 that you mentioned before in terms of the cost of carbon that Americans are currently paying per metric ton, or whatever the figure was?
So the 16 tons of CO2 per capita. So yes, which by the way is down already from like a height of 20 or so.
So we're moving in the right direction.
We are not fast enough, right?
And let's put into context the wildfires, the smoke we're experiencing right now, as a percentage of the problem. I know it's hard to quantify perhaps, but there are so many factors. This is the most visible one. How much are wildfires and smoke, et cetera, and how much is that really the biggest problem, or is it really just a small fraction of what we're seeing?
So right now, it's clearly the most visible problem. That is clear. The biggest costs as part of the overall calculations of how much change truly costs are human health impacts. Are people literally dying from, falling ill from? And yes, wildfires contribute to that, but as sort of the quantified mechanisms in the global sense, it is a visible problem. It's not the largest item here as part of the actual calculation. But frankly, wildfires, like the one we are seeing right now, right, will clearly mean that, now that's something climate economists, scientists will focus on even more than before. And maybe we do find that actually when you do truly quantify, monetize those damages, that they are much larger than we had previously thought.
Yeah. Well, definitely a conversation that will be continued. So thank you for joining us, Professor.
Thank you.